George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle, calm, reserved, even shy in interviews. But that public image was only half the truth. Behind the gentle smile and spiritual aura was a man with a razor-sharp memory, someone who carried grudges for years, sometimes decades. Whether it was idols who let him down, bandmates who dismissed him, or new stars who disrespected the Beatles' legacy, George Harrison never forgot. And when he spoke out, his words cut deeper than any guitar riff. So who exactly did George Harrison truly dislike? And what do these rivalries reveal about the man behind the legend? Born in Liverpool on February 25, 1943, George Harrison grew up in a working-class family. His mother encouraged his love of music, and by his teenage years, George was already obsessed with guitars. While his classmates were chasing ordinary jobs, he was chasing chords, riffs, and the sounds of rock and roll drifting across the Atlantic. At 16, he dropped out of school and joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney in their early group, the Quarrymen. That decision would change his life forever. By 1960, George was on tour in Germany with the band that would soon become the Beatles. But fame came at a cost. The Beatles were a four-man group, but the spotlight often shone on only two names: Lennon and McCartney. George may have been nicknamed the Quiet Beatle, but his silence wasn't always out of choice. His songs were routinely pushed aside, often limited to just 2 or 3 per album. To a young songwriter hungry for recognition, this stung. As the years passed, those frustrations built up, and they didn't fade away. They hardened into grudges, some against his idols, some against his friends, and some against the very industry that had once celebrated him. Like many teenagers in the 1950s, George Harrison was electrified by Elvis Presley. One day, riding his bike through Liverpool, George heard "Heartbreak Hotel" coming from a nearby house. The sound hit him like lightning. In his own words, "When I first heard Elvis, I knew I was never going to be the same again." For George, Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was proof that music could be raw, rebellious, and life-changing. That inspiration carried George through his early years and even shaped the Beatles' sound. But by the 1970s, when George finally met his idol, the magic had vanished. Instead of the rebellious young rock star, Elvis had become a Vegas act. Flashy white jumpsuits, brass sections, and endless backup singers. To Harrison, it looked more like a parody than a performance. After the meeting, George sighed to friends. "I just wanted to tell him, put on some jeans, a black shirt, drop the backup singers and the trumpets, and go play 'That's All Right, Mama' like you used to." Word of this critique reached Elvis, who reportedly responded with a cold smile. "If he thinks I'm going back to playing in little bars just to please somebody, then he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley." What had started as worship ended in disappointment and bitterness. George mourned the loss of what Elvis represented, a purity that had been swallowed by glitter and showbiz. But Elvis wasn't the only figure who would break George's heart. Inside the Beatles themselves, another relationship was already cracking. George and Paul first connected as kids. They took the same bus to school, bonded over guitars, and played together until their fingers bled. Paul even called George his kid brother. But as the Beatles rose, that brotherhood became strained. Paul increasingly took creative control, especially after Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. George's contributions were often sidelined, his songs pushed aside. The tension boiled over during the recording of Abbey Road in 1969. George fought to defend his material, snapping at Paul's constant suggestions. At one point, George even said bluntly, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney." That's the truth. I respect Paul, but sometimes he's just too overpowering. Paul later admitted, "I always thought our songs were better than George's, but by the end, his were at least as good as ours." Even after the Beatles split, George couldn't resist taking jabs. In a 1974 interview, he remarked, "Paul has ruined me as a guitar player." And yet, beneath the rivalry, there was still a strange bond. George admitted, "No matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together." It was brotherhood, damaged but never completely erased. But while his bond with Paul was complicated, his feelings for John Lennon were far colder. Early on, George admired Lennon's wit and sharp creativity, but admiration turned to resentment as John often dismissed George's songwriting and spirituality. When George brought in new demos, Lennon would shrug them off with indifference. He openly mocked George's fascination with Indian mysticism, cutting him off in the studio with comments like, "Don't start telling me about those Indian saints again." By the Beatles' final years, the distance was undeniable. Lennon could be cutting and selfish, while George grew increasingly bitter. In his autobiography, I, Me, Mine, George almost completely omitted John's name. That silence was louder than any insult. When asked why, George simply smiled and said, "Some things don't need to be mentioned." Even after Lennon's death in 1980, George didn't sugarcoat the past. He mourned, but he never rewrote history. The wounds had never healed. George was known for being reserved, but in 1992, he let loose in a rare moment of candor. During a conversation with Bob Geldof, he didn't hesitate when asked about Neil Young. "I'm not a Neil Young fan, I hate it. I can't stand it." He went further, mocking Neil's voice. "I like a couple of his songs, but I hate that voice worse than mine." He even mimicked Young's guitar style, sneering, "He does a solo in the middle of a song, and I look at Eric Clapton and say, 'What's that about?'" Later that year, fate put Harrison and Young on the same stage at Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert. The tension backstage was noticeable. Neil smiled and performed as if nothing had happened. George, on the other hand, kept his distance. When asked about George's remarks, Neil responded gracefully, "Everyone's entitled to an opinion." "I didn't like certain artists when I first heard them either, but time changes how you see things." But George never changed his tune about Neil. For him, that voice was unforgivable. For George, spirituality wasn't just a hobby, it was sacred. Music and faith were intertwined, and sincerity was non-negotiable. That's why he clashed so strongly with Pete Townshend of The Who. Townshend was known for weaving spiritual themes into his music, especially in Tommy. He often spoke about enlightenment and peace, but George wasn't buying it. In a 1966 interview, he dismissed Townshend outright. "Every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff." To George, it wasn't just hypocrisy, it was a betrayal of art. The tension only deepened when Townshend quietly supported Eric Clapton in pursuing Pattie Boyd, George's first wife. Though George never spoke publicly about Townshend's involvement, it was another fracture in trust. For Harrison, Townshend wasn't just another rock star. He was a warning of what happens when spirituality becomes a stage act. In the 1990s, Oasis was hailed as the new Beatles. Fans and critics alike saw them as carrying the torch for British rock. But George Harrison wasn't impressed. When asked about Oasis, he bluntly said of frontman Liam Gallagher, "He seems a bit out of date and rather silly. He's just excess baggage." That remark exploded in the press. Liam, never one to stay quiet, fired back on MTV. "I still love the Beatles, but personally, I think he's an effing clown. If I saw him, I'd tell him straight. A proper clown." The spat highlighted a growing divide between generations. Fans hoping for unity between two British icons got the opposite: a public war of words. On the surface, George and Elton John appeared to be friends. They performed together and were photographed at parties. But behind the smiles, George had strong opinions. In a 1976 interview, he said bluntly, "Elton John's music is something I've never thought much of. Every song sounds the same. He wrote one good song many years ago, but the rest is just formula. Lyrics, 4 chords, shake it up, and you've got another Elton John hit." That kind of critique could have started a feud, but Elton never fired back. In fact, years later he spoke of George with respect, calling him the wise man of the Beatles. In his memoir, Elton recalled a party where George looked him in the eye and said, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." In a room full of enablers, George was the only one bold enough to speak honestly. Their relationship was complicated, cold at times, brutally honest at others. But even when George criticized Elton's music, there was an undercurrent of genuine care. George Harrison's grudges reveal a side of him often hidden behind the stereotype of the quiet Beatle. He wasn't passive. He wasn't always gentle. He was fiery, uncompromising, and deeply protective of authenticity. He carried bitterness toward idols who sold out, bandmates who overshadowed him, and stars who he believed lacked sincerity. But beneath the sharp words was a man who valued truth, even when it hurt. Maybe George Harrison didn't truly hate people. Maybe he hated illusions, the lies, the fakery, and the masks that fame forced onto artists. And in a way, that's what made him different. George Harrison wasn't just searching for recognition. He was searching for something real.